Chapter 10, Closing Schools and Colleges and Universities. Should a society sacrifice the interests of all of its children and young people to prolong the lives of a portion of the oldest and sickest? COVID policies have caused lost or impaired education for 350 children and young people for each one COVID death averted. Should a society sacrifice the interests of all of its children and young people to prolong the lives of a portion of the oldest and sickest? In the United States, we closed almost all schools for the spring of 2020, and many or perhaps most have been closed to in-person instruction for most or all of the 2020 to 2021 school year. Children are at almost no risk of dying from COVID. They are at much less risk of dying from COVID than they are from ordinary influenza each year, as elaborated in Chapter 13. Footnote: 47 children aged 5 to 14 have died from COVID in the U.S. up to December 12, 2020, according to the CDC. Whereas in the 2017 to 18 flu season, 528 children aged 5 to 17 died from influenza, also according to the CDC. End footnote. Adults in their 20s are also at less or equivalent risk of dying from COVID than influenza, Chapter 13. So college students are also at essentially no risk of dying from COVID and at no greater risk than they are every year from dying from influenza. We closed their schools anyway and prevented students from playing sports or engaging in choir or other extracurricular activities. Since they were at lower risk from COVID than they are every year from influenza, this was clearly not done for their benefit. We required this sacrifice from children for the sole benefit of those at significant risk of dying from COVID, their grandparents and great-grandparents. We sacrificed the interests of children, and not trivial interests, but their interest in getting an education like every previous generation got, in normal social development, from meeting with and socializing with their peers at school, and in fun and enjoying their lives by socializing with other kids at school and playing with other kids and playing sports or engaging in other extracurricular activities, for the sole benefit of the oldest and sickest people in society with very few years of life expectancy remaining. We have a moral obligation toward our children. They are 100% dependent on us to do what is right for them. They have a right to get an education, to socialize with their peers, to be allowed normal social development, and to play and have fun. We have violated those rights, and we have abandoned our responsibilities to them. And why did we abandon our duties to all our children and violate these supreme moral duties? Because we were scared by a strain of the flu going around that is 3.5 times deadlier than ordinary influenza and shortens the lives of 0.2% of the population by 4 years on average. Chapters 2, 3, and 13. This boggles my mind. I cannot fathom how anyone, let alone teachers and parents, and apparently the majority of society, could believe this was morally justified, let alone a good idea. We should also note that closing the schools to in-person instruction will worsen the black, white, and rich-poor achievement gaps. Students who are motivated to learn have educated parents who can teach them and have 2 parents with some money so one can stay home with the child will be less harmed by closing the schools than children without some or all of those advantages. I have never seen any official even deign to articulate the reasons why schools needed to be closed. It is just stated that it was necessary, or this is for safety. Safety of whom? Not the children. As I have stated, they are at lower risk from COVID than they are from ordinary influenza. At least if officials are going to inflict this harm on every child and college student in America, they can do us the courtesy of explaining very clearly, with actual data, facts, and articulated reasoning, why they believe this is necessary and why the benefits of this step exceed the harms and justify us abandoning our moral duty to children in our care. How do the numbers work out? There are 62 million Americans aged 5 to 19. For ages 6 to 18, it is about 53 million. There are about 19 million college students in the U.S. So altogether, about 70 million students in K through 12 and colleges and universities. 70 million divided by 200,000 COVID deaths averted is 350 students whose schooling and social development and enjoyment of childhood or young adulthood has been severely impaired per COVID death averted. Footnote: This is not to say that keeping 350 students out of school prevented one COVID death. It did not. My estimate of 200,000 COVID deaths averted is based on all of the restrictions, including closing workplaces, bars, restaurants, health clubs, and mandatory mask wearing, as well as closing schools. It is not clear that closing schools contributed significantly or at all to reducing the spread of COVID. In fact, the evidence discussed in Chapter 20 indicates closing schools did not prevent any COVID deaths. End footnote.